Hi there, it's Mr. Evans with a video on stakeholder mapping and how to do that. We are looking at this section of the specification here. In this part of the specification, looking at stakeholders. So stakeholder mapping, a guy called Mandelo is credited with creating a power grid that categorises stakeholders by comparing their interest in an organisation to their power over it. So you'll see in a minute there's a grid with two axes, which we'll have a look at in a second. The level of power axis is determined by the extent to which a stakeholder can influence the decisions that a company makes, and the level of interest is determined by the degree to which stakeholders will be influenced by those decisions. So it may be best to look at this in the context of an actual real-life business scenario. So if you're not aware of what's been going on down in the portal at Steelworks, it's the sort of thing that you should be keeping up with as a business student. But essentially, there has been a lot of doubt over the future of British steel due to very cheap Chinese imports, much cheaper than we can produce steel in the UK. And there was doubt over whether this steel plant would survive. It's owned by an Indian group called Tata, who are absolutely huge. The steelworks is only a very, very small part of their business, and they claimed that they were losing £1 million a day keeping the steelworks in Portal running. So there was a big issue about whether or not the steelworks would close, that was quite widely reported in the media. So if we have a look at this decision, so the decision, to make it clear, is whether or not this huge Indian group, absolutely massive company, steelworks only a very small part of this business, but they're losing £1 million a day, which is obviously a significant amount of money, and the business wanted to stop losing that money, and they wanted, or they thought at the time, that the best decision to make would be to close down or sell. More accurately, they wanted to sell to a competitor, the steelworks. So let's have a look at some stakeholders who were involved in this decision. So we've got along this axis here the power to influence, whether that's high or low, and the level of interest, whether that is high or low. And there are various strategies for dealing with the stakeholders noted in the grid. So the high power, high interest group, you would need to manage those stakeholders. High power, low interest, we want to look to satisfy those stakeholders. We would inform low power, high interest stakeholders what's going on. They want to know what's going on, but they haven't got very much power to influence the organisation. And minimal interest, low power, low interest, we don't need to waste our time too much with those stakeholders. So let's have a look at this. So first of all, the trade unions, very high interest in what was going on in the situation. They wanted their members to retain their jobs, retain their pensions, all of that kind of thing. They've got some power over the organisation in terms of being able to take strikes, but in this situation it wouldn't really do them much good. They're trying to persuade the company to keep this plant open. They don't particularly want their workers going out on strike. So the trade union really didn't have a huge amount of power. And the non-unionised employees had even less. They've got high interest because trade union members employed at the plant and non-union employees, they earn their living there. But in terms of this decision about whether or not to close the power plant, they had very little say in that. The directors of Tata Steel, on the other hand, have got high power and high interest. They don't want their part of Tata to be making a loss. They don't want their part of this huge company to be loss-making, and so therefore they've got a high interest in sorting this out, and they've got a lot of power over the situation. The Westminster government, the central government, became very interested in this because it's such a large employer in the area. I don't believe they offered them any financial incentives in the end, but there was certainly talk of potentially subsidising to a certain extent the maintenance of the plant, and talk of them funding the pensions deficit that had built up. So the central government was highly involved. They wanted to keep steelworks open, they wanted to keep this employer in the area, and because of their muscle, the government had relatively high power. They had the power to offer incentives to keep them to stay. They couldn't, if Tata had decided to sell up and leave, there wasn't actually much the government could do, but they did want to stop that. Local government had far less power, but arguably far more interest. Neath Council would be massively affected if this organisation closed, partly because of the effect it would have on suppliers, and partly because of the effect it would have on local businesses who seemingly have nothing to do with the steelworks, pubs, shops in the local area. But if this business were to close down, well, the suppliers would clearly be affected, particularly suppliers who only supply the steelworks, and they would probably go out of business too fairly rapidly. And then local businesses. I mean, if 3,000 odd jobs are lost in the steelworks, that's going to have a knock-on effect. They're not going to be going shopping in the shops, going to the local pub, eating in local restaurants. All of those sorts of businesses would have been highly affected, but they had very little power over the situation. Tourists visit the area. Maybe they would be counted in this low power, low interest group. Controversially, I've put shareholders in Tata in the high power, low interest category. The reason for that is that the steelworks really is only a very small part of this absolutely massive business. They own Jaguar, amongst a lot of other things, hotels, banking, insurance. They're in absolutely huge group. The steelworks represents a fairly small part of their business. So shareholders, I don't think, in the big picture, would be that bothered about what happens. However, they would have, reasonably high power to dictate if they wanted that to close, and that would probably have to happen. So you may disagree with how I categorise these groups, but I hope that helps you understand how to use the power grid. The key thing to realise is that where these stakeholders are positioned would dictate the strategies that the business uses to manage their relationships. Every business has got scarce resources, particularly things like time. You're going to want to manage the groups that have got high power and high interest. Maybe if it was a slightly different scenario, I'd gone through a supermarket opening 24 hours a day, a supermarket looking at extending its opening hours to 24 hours a day, you probably would want to consider the viewpoint of the employees a lot more in that situation, and manage that relationship with them to ensure that decision was successfully made. These guys, minimal, low power, low interest, you don't need to spend any time on them, or very little time anyway. I hope that kind of makes sense. Thanks for listening.